At its best, the higher education produces engaged, what they call critical thinkers who are crucial in the fight against fascism. Now, the future of democracy in the United States will not be determined by the malignant decisions made by a reactionary group of Supreme Court justices, nor is it going to be decided by the existence of voter suppression laws. Um, the ubiquity of the big lie, massive structural inequality, or the rise of white nationalism to the centers of power in a politics dominated by by a white supremacist ideology. Nor is it going to be decided by the rhetorical accelerant endlessly produced by Donald Trump with his frequent allusions to violence and armed revolt. It will be decided by the increasing collapse of conscience, the undermining of truth, and a mass consciousness that supports violence as a central weapon for social change. And to this degree, the public can be convinced, as Judith Butler argues, that the call for democracy is interpreted as sedition and the call for freedom is taken to be a call to violence. Democracy will suffer from a legitimization from a little for a legit for legitimation crisis and will disintegrate. Under such circumstances, it will be easier for the abyss of fascist politics to gain more legitimacy and prevail in the United States. Violence in the United States has gone into overdrive, building on a history of disposability, genocide, and militarism. It is increasingly and has gained support, particularly among the Repug Party, as a potentially justifiable path to power. How else are we going to explain the shocking defense by most Republicans of the insurrection against the Capitol on January 6th as a patriotic attempt to protect the nation against its enemies? And how do we reason and justice will prevail in a society when the legal justification given to a macho infused vigilantes in the aftermath of the wrongfully called Rittenhouse acquittal provides them with the pass to shoot, if not kill, peaceful protesters? And how else do we clarify the rise of deadly misogynistic violence that's operating under the discourse of surveillance and vigilantism, and that has moved from Texas to the law of the land, subjecting women to an incriminating reality that's going to dictate them that they are second-class citizens who can no longer have control over their reproductive rights. How else to address the rise of a gun culture that trades on fear, to immunize people to the tsunami of mass shootings, suffering, and death that appears as an everyday experience in the United States that we see every day? How else does one explain crazed images of guns being celebrated in the social media by repugs as if the spectacle of violence does not present a danger to our everyday public? In one telling instance, Representative Thomas Massey of Kentucky had posted a Christmas picture of himself and his family that appears to be his family, basically smiling and posing with an assortment of guns. And I'm going to show you the picture because you're going to see it here. See that there? I did see a picture the other day where somebody had photoshopped it and made it look like Yoldos, and that's a better picture. Just days after 4 teenagers were killed in the shooting at a high school in Michigan, accompanying the image was the tweet, "Merry Christmas, P.S. Santa, please bring more ammo." The image is more than insensitive and endorses a hyped-up version of gun culture while maximizing the pleasure potentially produced by an obsession with guns and the threats of violence. After all, it was intended as a virtual Christmas card, and what Massey mimics in this Christmas family photo is an echo of the cruelty and pornographic fascination and celebration of the spectacle of violence that's central to a fascist political era. And this merging of a pleasure, moral irresponsibility, and cruelty offers legitimation for the horror of violent acts, including the threat of violence as a political weapon. The image is symptomatic of a moral and political depravity that defines the Repug Party and its obsession with violence, fear, and death. With the rise in hate speech, right-wing extremist violence, gerrymandering, voter suppression, police violence, and staggering economic, health, and educational disparities, the UN Special Rapporteur Fernando Verones stated that the United States is becoming a darker, nastier, and more divided society. It should also come as no surprise that a number of organizations, from Freedom House to the European think tank International IDEA, report that democracy, at least what is left of it, is eroding the United States. The right-wing extremists have redefined the notion of freedom by detaching it from any sense of the common good and ethical considerations while reducing any vestige of liberty to an individual and utterly privatized right. Mimicking the democratic values, freedom now flees inward and reduced to almost pathological self-centeredness that is increasingly hostile to the common good, matters of mutual support and social responsibility, concerns for the public good, if not the social bonds that hold societies together, are undermined by an all-encompassing retreat into personal responsibility, and it places the burden of a change entirely on the one individual. But in this instance, freedom is privatized, hollowed out, and emptied of any considerations for social cost. Evidence of this retreat from social responsibility is evident in the refusal on the part of many Trump sycophants who refuse to get vaccinated against the deadly virus, regardless of the suffering and death it causes to others. Now, this position is now largely justified by extremists in the name of individual freedom and self-determination. The language of violence has become normalized among a Republican Party that is indifferent to its fringe elements. Increasingly, they threaten the lives of politicians that they disagree with, and moreover, it has become ensconced in the collective consciousness for a large segment of the public as a routine way to address social problems and drive political rhetoric and annihilate dissent and resistance. Violence now defines the very essence of politics and increasingly has become a routine element of everyday life. School shootings have become an everyday occurrence that's further accelerated by the Republican legislators who argue that anyone should be able to buy as many guns as they fucking want, regardless of the fucking danger that the gun violence poses to the public. As blood flows in the corridors of malls, schools, synagogues, and houses of worship, the right-wing Republicans talk about more openly in violent terms, threatening their opponents with the use of force and mobilizing their followers with a call for armed confrontation. Unsurprisingly, one revealing and increasingly symptomatic incident took place in October at a conservative Klan rally in western Idaho. A young man stepped up to a microphone and asked, "When do we get to use our guns to start killing the Democrats?" And the audience being inbred and retarded as they are, applauded. He then asked, "How many elections are they going to steal before we kill these people?" They didn't steal any election, retard. Lisa Lurer and Osted Hardin of the New York Times reported that the local state representative, a Republican leader, called it a fair question. The racist spirit of the Ku Klux Klan and the politics of racial cleansing had merged with the uncheckered greed and systemic violence of a second Gilded Age to create an updated fascist politics that now drives the Repug Party. As white supremacy moves from the fringes of politics to the centers of the economic, political, and social power, the boundaries of those considered disposable and unknowable widens to what we call escalating police violence, voter suppression laws, and the ever-increasing poison spread by right-wing social media. The views are critical of racism. They attack on academic freedom or the lives of those who thrive on denouncing reason and science, and they are dismissed as fake news. While those journalists, school board members, politicians, and educators who oppose a rising fascist politics are subject to insults, threats, and violence. In addition, the Republican Party's drive to ensure minority rule is working overtime to gut the labor rights, destroy the environment, subvert majority rule, roll back the protection for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, the women, people of color, young people, and others who have benefited from civil rights gains that have been won through generations of a struggle. The Republican Party, the Republican war against reason, critical education, and thinking itself is working, but violence is increasingly accepted by many people in the United States as a solution to addressing political problems. The language of militarism and violence dominates much of the right-wing social media, and its pedagogical reach keeps growing. I'm not sure if I said that right, but who cares? For instance, the rising threat of extremism is evident in the growing culture of racism that's nurtured by the Republican Party and its acolytes. Excuse me. Anthony DiMaggio's analysis of the Republican Party's alignment with white supremacist views is eye-opening, and it's worth quoting at length. Now here's what he said. 8 in 10 Republicans feel that America is in danger of losing its culture and identity, and nearly as many Republicans, 79%, agreeing that the American way of life needs to be protected from foreign influence. Conceptions of American identity clearly overlap strongly with white supremacy. 51% of Republicans agreeing that America must protect and preserve its white European heritage. An equal number saying a culture established by the country's early European immigrants is important to the United States' identity as a nation. Nearly two-thirds of Republicans based their commitment to protecting the American identity on a reactionary religious value, with 63% saying that one must be Christian to be truly American. But the thing about Republicans, they're not Christian; they're fake Christians. The January 6th Klan insurrection was one stage in the evolution of politics that now enshrines violence as a potential path to power. Racial terror and a clarion call to violence dominates American politics, amplified by a mainstream press that refuses to name it as a form of a fascist politics, and the right-wing media that rebels in a spectacularized culture of threats and violence. Aaron Blake wrote in the Washington Post, states that not only do 31% of American adults believe the election was stolen, which it wasn't, they also sympathize with the statement that because things have gotten so far off track, fake patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. You mean destroy it? Citing an American Enterprise Institute poll, DiMaggio states that more than 39% of Republicans agree that if elected leaders will not protect America, the people must do it themselves, even if it requires a call to violence. The landscape of violence no longer hides in the dark or the fringes of politics, as it was obvious with the January 6th Klan attack on the Capitol. In addition, there are the many instances of violence emerging in the last few years from the politics that were loyal to the Trump, along with many of his sycophants. And some of the more visible and threatened acts of violence include Representative Paul Gosar's cartoon depiction that represented killing Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and swinging swords at Biden. And there was also the Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's claim that the only way to get freedom back is with the price of blood. And Greene's call to violence became more specific in the video, in which he endorsed calls to execute FBI agents that were deemed disloyal to the squatter Donald Trump and to target top Democrats, including a bullet to the head for Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And more recently, former Trump advisor Michael Flynn, who now sees himself as a spokesperson for a fundamentalist religious army, advocated a right-wing Christian takeover of America with this call for one nation under God and one religion under God, which we know that God doesn't exist. Flynn is simply symptomatic of the theoretic war being waged by right-wing radical Christian extremists against both democracy and Christianity. This unholy alliance between Christian extremists and fascism is now a fundamental force in the Republican Party, and its rhetoric wing is as dangerous as its motley group of white supremacists, Nazis, and militia movements. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of the Republican Party, including House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, have refused to censor those calls to violence, giving credits to Greene's claim that that the conservatives in the House of Representatives aren't the fringe. We actually represent the base of the Republican voters, which is approximately 70%, and when the party learns to represent conservative Americans, we will never lose again. Yeah, you will. Jonathan Friedland is right in stating that Greene and Gosar are in lockstep with the Republican Party, whose face can be seen in the death threats now routinely meted out. To nationally famous politicians such as AOC and others, the threats of violence on the part of the Republican Party and the large majority of its sycophants are only one register of its grip toward authoritarianism. And more significant concern is how such violence works in tandem with the range of cultural apparatuses to legitimize the use of such violence as part of the drive to destroy democracy and instill an authoritarian government. The threat of murderous violence is not restricted to Trump's unhinged political flunkies. Such threats also inhabit the daily world of the microaggressions aimed at destroying the day-to-day social relations that enable people to gain some control over their lives. We live in the age of the Trump-inspired raging mobs. Heather Cox Richardson makes some of these micro-assaults visible in her claim that violent gangs are becoming a central political force in America, and even hers is worth quoting at length too. Since January 6th, angry mobs have driven the election officials out of office in fear for their safety. An increasingly angry protest that they have threatened school board members over transgender rights and over teaching critical race theory, which is a legal theory from the 1970s that is not, in fact, in the general kindergarten curriculum. Now, as the coronavirus rages again, they are showing exactly how this process works as they threaten the local officials who are following the guidelines issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to require masks. Although a morning consult poll shows that 69% of Americans want to return to mask mandates, local mobs also oppose masking, and they are dominating the public spaces and forcing officials to give in to their demands. In Franklin, Tennessee, anti-mask mobs threatened doctors and nurses, asking the local school board to reinstate a mask mandate in the schools. "And we will find you," they shouted at a man leaving the meeting. "We know who you are." As Brad Evans, one of our most astute theoreticians of violence, has made clear, the long legacy of violence espoused by Trump and his acolytes that constitute not simply the development of slow violence at work and emptying politics of its democratic values, but the decree to which violence has become routinized, basically, and politics turned into a machinery of fear, terror, and death. And more militarism and violence now dominate the public imagination in the United States, underlying the diverse attempts of the right-wing Republicans to destroy public education. Basically, we overturn election results, subvert abortion rights, and produce malign forms of lawlessness in different forms of disenfranchisement is a long-term goal of destroying any vestige of democracy in the public institutions that support it. But there is more at work here than the debasement of politics. There is also a systemic struggle to undermine the public imagination and create the conditions for the wider public to internalize the need for violence as a form of habitual domination. What ties all these incidents of violence together is whether it will be an attack on dissent, women's abortion rights, voting rights, or social justice. It is both a limited understanding of the theories and practice of freedom and the growing repressive educational forces that serve to depoliticize people. In this case, the forces of authoritarianism are deepened and extended throughout the American society through an image-based culture of manufactured ignorance and an overcharged cult of lies produced both in right-wing cultural apparatuses, toxic social media spheres, and current attacks on public and higher education. At the heart of this emerging rebrand fascism is a politics that's deeply at work in the struggle over consciousness, identity, subjectivity, values, and agency. As Paul Street observes, public knowledge is a matter of life and death, particularly when it is conditioned to offer little resistance to the political hurricane of the white nationalist authoritarianism, fascist American style that is bearing down on the United States today. The merging of historical amnesia, manufactured ignorance, and a culture of fear and violence have become a major pedagogical force in American politics and cultural. Yet this ongoing struggle over consciousness, waged by proto-fascists through diverse forms of political and popular education and a variety of cultural sites, is largely underplayed or ignored as a dangerous force in American society. The misunderstanding and theoretical failure is particularly true among the Democrats and left-oriented critics, except for a few political public intellectuals such as Angela Davis, Robin Kelly, Noam Chomsky, Paul Street, Tony DiMaggio, Jeffrey St. Clair, and some other journalists and public intellectuals. There was little sense among too many educators, cultural workers, protesters, and anti-capitalists and anti-racist groups that politics is educative. What we are suggesting here is that there is little hope for social change unless people can be persuaded to invest in politics in which they can recognize themselves and their problems, and they can develop a moment of recognition and broader understanding of resistance, politics, and the collective struggle. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and other anti-racist and social justice advocates are trying to change our understanding of the crucial relationship between the education and the politics, but their voices are underemphasized, and they are largely muted by the dominant right-wing media from reaching large segments of the American public. It's not enough for those of us struggling for a radical democracy to be horrified over the workings of the Trump Supreme Court, the fascist politics being implemented by the right-wing state legislators, the normalization of white supremacist ideology, the expanding forms of domestic terrorism, and the ever-present culture of cruelty and violence that has enveloped in the United States. And people cannot escape from the ideological terror machinery of culture that convinces them that all their problems are a matter of individual responsibility. then that matter of class, racism, misogyny, and other forms of oppression are not systemic, and that the privatization of everything should not be viewed as a powerful form of depoliticization. The United States will soon move to a full-fledged rebranded fascist social order, but there is no genuine democracy collective move for resistance and expanding defense of public goods without genuine opposing critical power, and that the power of its core is educational. Um, the failure of the progressives to recognize this is evident in too many short-sighted treatments of the Republican Party's attack on critical race theory. This is simply not an attack on history as a dangerous memory, dissent, academic freedom, and racial injustice. This is a much more broader attack on the very institutions that produce engaged citizens into critical agency and critical thought itself. It is a full-fledged attack on both the democratizing purpose of education and the institutions that support its democratic possibilities. But under the narrow rubric of an attack on critical race theory, what we are witnessing is a wider attack on the ability to link moral authority with intellectual competency with intellectual competencies that extend from learning history and learning civic virtue to critically engage in the most malign threats to democracy and social and economic justice. And this is even more what they call reason to take seriously the attack on education in the specific and broader sense, as one of the main sites of struggle over consciousness, power, identity, agency, politics, and the ability to find and struggle for a socialist future. That's basically about it. Basically right there. But you get the idea. But yeah. But if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And thanks for listening.